town of Ironwood was a place where dreams came to die, a rough frontier settlement carved out of pine and sweat, where men came with calloused hands and left with empty pockets. And on that gray afternoon, as rain-soaked clouds rolled low over the sawmills and the air stank of resin and whiskey, the townsfolk gathered in the muddy square for an auction that few spoke of openly, but many attended. For behind the rough wooden platform, women stood lined like cattle, each with a coarse burlap sack pulled over her head, their wrists bound with fraying rope, their futures to be sold to the highest bidder. Some men shouted crude jokes, some eyed the figures with greedy hunger, but among them stood a man apart, a lumberjack whose massive shoulders bore the weight of solitude more heavily than any log he'd ever split, his clothes damp from weeks in the woods, his beard thick and untamed, his eyes weary from too many nights staring at a cabin wall with no voice to break the silence. And when the auctioneer's hammer fell on one after another, daughters, runaways, women discarded by fate, he remained silent until at last a figure was dragged forward, smaller than the rest, her shoulders trembling, the sack hiding not just her face, but her story, and the jeers from the crowd grew louder because no one wanted her. No one bid. The price dropped lower and lower until the auctioneer snarled in frustration and barked, $2, and she's yours. And in that moment the lumberjack's hand rose, quiet and steady, his voice gruff as he said, I'll take her. And the crowd erupted in laughter, mocking a man so desperate he'd buy what others wouldn't touch. But he didn't care, because when the woman stumbled toward him, her thin frame shivering in the drizzle, he saw not disgrace, but a soul abandoned by the world, and though he couldn't see her face, he felt the weight of her silence pressing against his chest like a plea. So, without another word, he took her hand, untied the rope at her wrists, and led her away from the jeering mob, his boots sinking into the mud as they walked out of town. Two broken lives bound by the smallest of prices and the largest of unknowns, and as the pines swallowed them whole, the wind whispered like a promise that this story was only beginning. The cabin stood at the edge of the timberline where the pines whispered like sentinels, its roof patched with rough shingles and its hearth cold when he pushed the door open, leading her inside with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the brutality of the world she had just been dragged from. And as the shadows swallowed them, she clutched the sack over her head with both hands as though it were her last defense, the one barrier between her and judgment. But he said nothing, only lit the fire, the crackle of dry kindling filling the silence as he hung his soaked coat on a nail by the door. She hovered near the wall, her breath quick, her body coiled like a deer ready to bolt, and finally he spoke, his voice low and steady like the creak of old timber, telling her she had nothing to fear here, that no man's hand would strike her in this cabin, not while he drew breath, and that though the world had bought her with coin, he would never claim her by force, because she was not property, she was a person, and she would show him her face only when she chose to, only when she was ready to tell him her name. And at that, she shifted, surprised because she had expected cruelty, hunger, demand. But instead she found patience and something even stranger, loneliness, the kind she knew too well. Days passed with the rhythm of an unspoken pact, him rising at dawn to split logs and haul timber while she lingered inside, preparing simple meals. Her silence a constant presence, but her eyes watching him with growing curiosity from beneath the sack whenever she thought he didn't notice. And at night they would sit by the fire, him carving figures from pine to pass the hours, her hands folded in her lap, the quiet stretching not like a noose but like a thread binding them together. Once, when he cut his hand on the blade, she gasped and moved to his side without thinking, pressing a cloth against the wound, her touch trembling but tender, and for the first time he saw how much she longed to care, how much she longed to be seen even as she hid, and in that moment, he whispered again that he would wait, whether it took days or years, because her name was not just a word, it was the key to her freedom, and when she was ready, when she trusted him enough to speak it, he would know the woman beneath the sack, not just the shape of her shadow, and those words haunted her long into the night as she lay awake in the corner of the cabin, staring at the flicker of firelight through rough burlap, wondering if perhaps, for the first time, she had been bought not as a prisoner, but as a chance at something she had never known, dignity, safety, maybe even love. The days of quiet routine ended the moment the echo of hooves thundered through the pines, a sound that didn't belong to deer or elk, but to men, rough men who rode with the kind of purpose that made the earth itself seem to tremble. And when she heard it, she froze by the cabin window. Her breath caught beneath the sack as the memories of chains, fists, and dark promises clawed back into her chest. While outside, the lumberjack straightened from the chopping block, axe still in his hands, his eyes narrowing as he counted the riders through the trees. 4 men, guns slung low, their faces twisted with the smug cruelty of hunters who had cornered their prey. And as they drew closer, one called out, laughing that he'd tracked a runaway clear across state lines, that the auction had cheated them of their rightful property, and that the woman with the sack was theirs to take back. But the lumberjack stood in front of the cabin door, his massive frame casting a shadow across the porch, his voice calm yet edged like steel as he told them they'd have to ride through him first. And when the leader spat and reached for his revolver, the woman gasped, stumbling forward, her trembling voice cracking through the air as she cried out her name at last, Clara. And in that single word she gave him both her truth and her trust, as if by speaking it aloud she was no longer a ghost hiding behind burlap, but flesh and blood worthy of being defended, worthy of belonging, and the sound of it fueled the lumberjack like fire in his veins. The first shot split the silence, but his axe was already in motion, swinging with the force of a lifetime in the timber yards, splitting the rifle clean from the man's grasp, and chaos erupted. Gunfire, shouts, the crack of fists, and the thud of bodies against dirt, until the yard became a battlefield lit by the red glow of the setting sun. And though he bled from a graze at his shoulder, the lumberjack fought like a bear protecting its den, while Clara, still trembling, did the unthinkable. She tore the sack from her head, lifted the dropped revolver with shaking hands, and fired, the shot ringing out true and sending one rider fleeing into the trees, his courage shattered. When at last the dust settled, 2 lay groaning in the mud, another galloped off with rage in his eyes, and the leader lay pinned beneath the lumberjack's boot, snarling that Clara would never be free, but with her unveiled face streaked in tears and firelight, she stepped forward and said in a voice steadier than she felt, I am free because I am no longer afraid to speak my name. And with that, the lumberjack dragged the man to his horse and sent him limping into the forest, his warning carried by bruises rather than words, before turning back to her, his chest heaving, his eyes locking onto hers for the first time without burlap between them. And in that gaze, as her name lingered in the air between them, she felt the world shift. She was no longer a woman bought for $2, but a woman who had chosen to be seen. The morning after the fight dawned quiet, the mist curling low across the pines as if the forest itself held its breath. And inside the cabin the lumberjack sat with his arm bound in a strip of cloth, his eyes on the woman who now sat across from him without her sack. Her face revealed to the light for the first time, not the face of shame she had feared he would see, but one marked with strength carved by suffering, with scars that told stories sharper than words, and when their gazes met, she no longer looked away but held it, steady and unflinching, and he spoke her name, Clara, with a reverence that made her chest ache, as if he were saying it not for the first time, but as though it had been waiting on his tongue for years. In that stillness, she told him her truth, the life she had fled, the cruelty of a man who had treated her as property, the terror of nights when she dreamed only of escape, and the shame that had made her hide even from herself. And when she finished, tears streaking her cheeks, she expected silence or pity, but instead he reached across the rough wooden table, his calloused hand enveloping hers, and told her that her past did not chain her here, that he had not bought her as a prize or possession, but as a chance, for him to give what little he had and for her to decide whether to stay, and that if she chose to leave, the door was hers. But if she chose to stay, he would vow himself to her before God and the forest that had raised him. Her heart trembled at the enormity of his words, and when the sun cut through the window, spilling gold across the cabin floor, she whispered, I choose to stay. And with those words the world shifted again, for later that day beneath the towering pines with birdsong their only choir and the scent of resin in the air, he stood with her hand in his, his deep voice carrying the vows he had carved into his heart, promising her not riches, but safety.